Hi guys, welcome back. I hope you all enjoyed the lecture last week. Like I say, if you've got any questions that stem from that lecture, then feel free to pass them to Sarah, probably via email is the best thing, then she can forward them on to me. And then when we get to the last in this series of lectures, then we can do a little bit of a Q&A, answer any questions you might have had, just to give you a little bit more clarity on what we've been talking about. All right, so obviously last week we spoke about the physiology behind developing strength and power. Today, we're going to focus a little bit more in a practical sense on strength development, right? Obviously, to help you when it comes to critiquing and designing a training program, okay? So obviously, when it comes to resistance training, which typically what we're going to be talking about today when we're talking about developing strength, obviously there's a few things that you need to consider, okay? And obviously, when you're critiquing your training plan or designing your training plan, these are things that always need to be at the forefront of your mind. Okay, obviously this is going to be different for everybody. All right, so let's move that up a little bit so you can see the screen a bit better. So obviously it's the magnitude of the individual effort and structure of the training stimulus that ultimately determines the outcomes associated with resistance training. Okay, so what that means obviously is making sure that the person who you're working with obviously is putting in the right amount of effort for the session. All right, so obviously that comes down to them. But then obviously the structure of the training stimulus, which is basically just what we're going to give the person to do, obviously that comes down to us, and that's what we have the most control over. Okay, and obviously, without saying, that's going to determine the outcome. All right, so obviously both those things are aligned, then obviously we're going to have a good outcome. Okay, so obviously main thing, or one of the biggest things, is obviously the training goal. Okay, so whether we're looking to develop muscle size or hypertrophy strength, either maximal strength or submaximal strength, depending upon the sport or the athlete that we're working with. Obviously, power, speed, or muscular endurance. Okay, obviously, all those things determine what goes into the program. Okay, then again, obviously, we've got training experience. Okay, so obviously, when you get out into the working world, you could be working with people, or you might already be working with people who have a very broad range of training experience. Okay, so they could either be a complete beginner, even in a sporting situation. Yeah, if you're working with academies, you could be working with kids, kind of early teens who've never really done much resistance training before. Obviously, all the way through to elite athletes. Okay, and again, if you're working in more of a less sporting setting, so maybe just in a normal kind of gym, then again, you're going to have that full spectrum of people, right? Which obviously, again, is a big thing to consider when you're designing their training program. All right, obviously, injuries. Okay, so it's always worth looking back into previous injuries and obviously existing injuries. Okay, and whether they've been short or long term, the nature of those injuries, if they've been kind of impact injuries, so broken bones, or if they've been more like soft tissue injuries, so ligaments, tendons, that kind of stuff. Obviously, impact injuries, there's nothing you can do about that. That's just part of sport. The soft tissue injuries, then obviously good strength and conditioning and having a good strength and conditioning protocol can help prevent soft tissue injuries. Okay, that's something that's been shown. So if the person has a history of soft tissue injuries, particularly if it's always in the same place, then that might be a weakness that you can look to address within a training program. Okay, obviously specificity to sport, so in terms of the needs of the sport, but also taking into account that person's position if it's a team sport, right? Obviously, like we said last week, the demands on, say, a striker versus the demands on a goalkeeper are going to be very different because of the nature of the position. Okay, and then obviously the big thing with all of this is looking at how this fits with the long-term goal. Okay, so when we start to talk about periodization in a couple of weeks, right, obviously periodization is the act of planning out a long-term training cycle with a specific goal or a number of specific goals in mind, depending on the sport. So at all times, you want to make sure that what we're doing is aligned with the goal. So the time you spend with that person and the time they spend either on their own or with you working on the training that you're giving them is aligned to a long-term goal, which ultimately in performance environment is what they're going to be judged on, what you're going to be judged on. So you want to make sure, obviously, that that's a success. Okay. On to the next one. There we go. Okay, so looking at things in a little bit more detail. All right, so specifics of resistance training, designing a resistance training program. regardless of the goal, there's certain things that we need to be thinking about at all times. Okay, so obviously muscle action, all right, which like we spoke about last week, the nature of the contraction, volume, so the overall training volume, and we'll talk a little bit more about that and how you calculate that. Obviously the load, which is going to be determined on a number of things. So obviously the actual goal of the training program might determine the load. The person's experience might determine the load. Also, when we talk about periodization, and at the end, when we look at a few kind of example workouts, the load is going to be in part determined by where that player is or athlete is in their season competitively, or if it's say pre-season or off-season. All right, obviously the load is going to be varied quite a bit at those different times of year. All right, obviously exercise selection, which again is going to be sport specific, position specifics in some cases, and also kind of level of experience specific, the workout structure, the repetition velocity. Okay, so this is more something that you need to think about when we're starting to look at kind of power development. And then obviously training frequency. Again, there's a huge range of variables that can determine the training frequency, pretty dependent on the level of athlete. Again, obviously, if you're working with elite team sport athletes who are professional, then the time they have to train versus the time a kind of recreational, say, triathlete has to train, and how you would fit strength training in with their regular triathlon training is going to have a big impact on their training frequency. Okay, so again, like we said last week, muscle action. All right, we're talking about concentric, eccentric, and isometric contractions. Okay, so obviously most resistance training programs include primarily dynamic repetitions that include both a concentric and eccentric muscle action. All right, obviously inevitably there's going to be some kind of isometric contraction in there too. If we take, say, a back squat, for example, obviously you've got the eccentric phase when you're lowering yourself down to the bottom of the squat. You've got the concentric phase on the way up, but at the same time, you've got a lot of isometric contraction through your core, holding your body stable, keeping the bar on your back to stop you collapsing in a heap. Okay, and then obviously as well, the same thing applies to most sporting movements. Okay. Now, the greatest force per unit of muscle size is produced during eccentric contractions. Okay, and eccentric contractions or muscle action is critical for optimal hypertrophy, but may result in more delayed onset muscle soreness compared to concentric muscle action. Okay, which obviously is as a result of that greater force per unit as you perform the eccentric action is what leads to the extra soreness. Okay. Dynamic muscular strength improvements are greatest when eccentric actions are included in the training program. And obviously advanced programs may include different forms of isometric training, the use of what we call supramaximal eccentric muscle action, and accommodating resistance devices such as bands and chains to maximize gains in strength and hypertrophy. Okay, so just to dive into that a little bit deeper and to give you a little bit more context as to what we're talking about there. Obviously, we know what the eccentric phase is. That's the lowering part of the movement. All right, and then obviously there, when we're talking about the dynamic muscular strength improvements being greatest when an eccentric contraction is included. All right, obviously eccentric actions, because of the greater force that's produced, all right, they're going to give you a better or a bigger stimulus for adaptation. Okay, so inevitably, the more stimulus you have for adaptation, the greater the improvements are going to be. All right, so when we're looking at designing a training program, obviously we might manipulate what the exercises that we do and the way we perform those exercises to maximize that eccentric phase. Okay, so if any of you come across what we call, say, tempo lifting. Okay, so again, let's say we're talking about a back squat, as opposed to just moving down into your squat, whatever feels like a natural speed. Okay, put in, say, a time on that. So saying to someone, okay, you're going to lower the weight, but you're going to take 5 seconds to lower the weight. Then as soon as you hit that bottom position, you're going to drive up fast. It's going to change the movement. All right, you're emphasizing the eccentric phase, increasing the load of each repetition. It's going to make it a lot tougher for them, like, which is obviously whilst we get more muscle soreness, but equally the strength improvements do tend to be greater from that kind of training. Okay, obviously there when we talk about supramaximal eccentric muscle action, okay, what that is basically assisted reps. Okay, so let's say you've got an athlete who's who's doing back squats, and you might get them to use a weight which you know they're not going to be able to stand up with. So obviously that requires you to be there, plus probably at least one other person. So when they go down into the bottom of their squat, they're focusing on going as slow as possible with as much weight as will allow them to stay in control of the movement. Okay, that's the key thing. There has to be that control there. And then you have you and maybe one other person to help them stand up. Okay, so an assisted rep. All right, and then obviously accommodating resistance. So the thing with accommodating resistance, all right, if you're not familiar with this, I'm sure you've probably seen pictures, videos. It's basically, obviously, again, let's use a squat example, having either bands, so resistance bands, or chains attached to the bar. Okay, what that means is as you stand up at the bottom of the movement, and the band stretches or the chains lift up off the floor, then it means obviously the overall load increases as there becomes more tension. Okay, which is just a good way to maximize the benefit you get from the concentric contraction. Okay, because obviously inevitably what happens, the first part, that again using the back squat, the first part of the movement, so from kind of below parallel up to about parallel is often the toughest for people, and then from there obviously as you get the benefit of the range of motion and the angle of joints, it's easier to stand up. Okay, but if we want to apply that in a sporting context where our movements are much more dynamic, then we want to focus on developing strength through the whole range of motion. Okay, so obviously the addition of the accommodating resistance forces the athlete to apply the force through the whole range of motion because of the increase in tension. Okay, so obviously you can see that how the way you manipulate muscle action can affect the outcome that we get and how you can use it to your advantage. Obviously within that, exercise selection is a key thing. Okay, so obviously single joint exercises stress one joint or major muscle group, whereas multiple joint exercises stress more than one joint or major muscle group. Okay, nice and self-explanatory. Both single and multiple joint exercises have been shown to be effective for increasing muscular strength in the targeted muscle groups. Single joint exercises have typically been used to target specific muscle groups and tend to pose less risk of injury, whereas multiple joint exercises involve more complex neural activation and coordination. And due to the larger muscle mass involvement, these exercises are generally more effective for improving strength. Okay, so again, just to give that a little bit more kind of practical application and dig into that a little bit deeper. All right, obviously, single joint exercise, as it suggests, are very useful for targeting a specific muscle group. Right, so when might we use this? All right, obviously with beginners where they may not have the coordination needed to perform multiple joint exercises effectively, then single joint exercises are a way to still build strength whilst they develop the coordination. Okay, but also if we're working with people who are recovering from injury, then they may have particular muscular imbalances that we can use single joint exercises to target. Okay, or it might be that just the nature of their injury means they can only do single joint exercises because they have to keep load away from a major joint. All right, and obviously multiple joint exercises, because of that larger muscle mass involvement, you get more of a hormonal response, which is why they're generally more effective when it comes to increasing strength. Okay, and then obviously for multiple joint exercises, you tend to be able to use more load. All right, so obviously the load you could perform on a back squat versus the load you could perform on a, say, single leg or even just a double leg seated leg extension is very, very different. Right, you're going to be able to back squat much more. So the neural stimulus that the back squat provides over the leg extension provides is much bigger. Okay, which again, when we're applying that to a sporting movement, which are all pretty much multi-joint exercises, it's much more specific to what we're going to be doing, and that transfer of training, which is a big thing, and a big thing you want to be thinking about, is going to be much greater. Okay. Obviously, like I mentioned there briefly, exercise using multiple or especially large muscle groups have been shown to have the greatest metabolic response. Okay, so multi-joint exercises have been shown to elicit greater rates of oxygen consumption. All right, obviously, because we're using more muscle groups, more oxygen is required, but also elicit greater hormonal responses, such as growth hormone, testosterone, okay, which obviously what your body needs to produce for muscle mass to increase. And when we're talking about increasing that cross-sectional area, that's what we want, okay? Obviously, the amount of muscle mass involved impacts the metabolic demands and the anabolic hormonal response. And like we were saying there, obviously exercise selection needs to consider the demands of the individual sport, because the goal of any training program is improved sports performance and not improved gym performance when you're working with people where performance is the goal. Okay, obviously if you're working either from a health perspective or you just had people who, they weren't focused on any particular sport, then that might be slightly different. But in a sport in the sense, all right, the goal of the training program is to help the sport. Okay, and that's the key thing you need to remember. It doesn't matter if you've got an athlete who can, say you're talking football, all right, let's say you've got a striker who can back squat 250 kilos, okay, but if that doesn't help them in the performance of scoring goals, whether that's with their running speed, whether that's with the power of them striking the ball, then the training program doesn't really play into the overall performance benefit that they want to be getting, okay, and using their time effectively. All right, now obviously exercise order and workout structure again are important considerations, okay, as the sequence of exercises and the number of muscle groups trained during a workout significantly affect the acute expression of muscular strength, okay? The major differences between structures are the magnitude of specialization observed during each workout, all right? So 3 to 4 exercises for a specific muscle group may be performed during a muscle group split routine, as opposed to 1 to 2 exercises for a muscle group in a total body workout. So that's what we're comparing here, okay? Whether we're going to do full body workouts or whether we're going to do focused muscle group workouts, all right? A major muscle group may be trained 1 to 2 times per week for a split routine, 2 to 3 times per week for, let's say, an upper lower body split, and 3 or more times per week for a total body workout, okay? But again, this all comes back to the question at the bottom, how this fits with the demands of the sport and the athlete's overall training load, okay? So obviously when we're focusing purely on, let's just say, a bodybuilding perspective, an aesthetic perspective, then that's where the idea of split routines kind of originated from, because it meant that you could hit specific muscle groups really, really hard, okay? So let's just say you're doing a day that involved your chest and triceps, obviously complementary muscle groups. You could do, like I said there, 3 to 4, but quite often even more exercises than that on those specific muscle groups. So you get a very intense stimulus, but then you may not train chest and triceps again for another week or another kind of 5 days or so as you work through the structure. Okay, obviously in comparison to that, you've got your total body workouts. All right, so what that can mean is either in that given session, you're using much more multi-joint workouts, okay, which are involving your whole body, all right, or it might be that, let's say you do, say, squats paired with some dumbbell chest press paired with some strict pull-ups. So you're hitting major muscle groups, but just one exercise per muscle group, sometimes 2, all right, in each workout, okay? Now again, taking that back to the demands of the sport, all right, so obviously as we've already spoke about, the demands of most sports predominantly involve multi-joint exercises, okay? So obviously when we're talking about training, then and the transfer of training into sport, then obviously we want to consider which exercises we're going to do, to help the athlete as much as possible with their sport. Now obviously if we're going to be doing, say, a split routine, you can still use multi-joint exercises, but if we're isolating specific muscle groups, chances are they're going to be much more kind of single joint focused, all right, which is going to take the transfer of training away from the sport and might also not get the best possible metabolic and hormonal response, okay? As well as that, all right, we also need to consider the athlete and where they are in a competition cycle, okay? And there's a good chance they're going to have more sport specific training to do unless they're in the off season, okay? So if they're in pre-season and obviously in season, then as well as just the strength and conditioning work they're going to be doing, they're also going to be doing skill work, okay? So it could be, let's say they're rugby players, obviously working on attack, working on defense, working on lineouts, working on scrums, on top of all the other training that they're going to be doing in the gym, okay, which might mean that really they don't have 5 sessions a week to be able to be in the gym. They only have 3 sessions per week. Okay, so if we've only got 3 sessions per week, then and you're doing kind of a split routine, then you only gives you 3 options or 3 workouts to be able to hit those muscle groups in that split routine. Whereas if we're using multi-joint exercises, which again are more specific to the sport anyway, then we're going to be able to hit those muscle groups, even though it might be less of an intense stimulus, more consistently throughout the week. Equally as well, though, don't forget, if those players are going out to play on the weekend, and through the week you've done, a really specific leg focused session, you need them to be able to perform. All right. So you've also got to factor in the recovery when we're talking about overall training load, so that when it comes to competition, especially in a team sport where they're going to be competing every week, they're in a fit state to be able to go out and perform at their best. Okay. So again, it's going to vary a lot depending on who you're working with, time of year, and their goal, but it's something which needs to be thought through when you're planning your training programs. Okay. So again, a little bit of a repeat there. So considering that multiple joint exercises have been shown to increase muscular strength, hypertrophy, and power, maximizing performance of these exercises may be necessary for optimal gains. Okay. Again, because of the number of muscle groups involved, these exercises, if we're combining different types of exercises, should be performed early in the training session when fatigue is minimal. Okay. And the sequencing of exercises for local muscular endurance may not be as important in comparison with strength and power, as obviously the fatigue is a necessary component of that local muscular endurance training. Okay, so what that means is if you combine in multiple joint and single joint exercises in a session, all right, it's always better to do the multiple joint exercises first. Okay, typically because they require the athlete to use more load, which is going to be more fatiguing. All right, but also they require more coordination. So you want the athlete to be fresh, so they can put everything into those multiple joint exercises, especially as that's where they're going to get the most benefit. Okay, and then there's just a few general recommendations for you to follow through there when it comes to designing your training program. Okay. Now load in. All right. Now obviously load in describes the amount of weight lifted or the resistance and exercises performed with, and is highly dependent on variables such as exercise order, the volume, the frequency, the muscle action, the repetition speed, and the rest interval length. Okay. Now, obviously, altering the training load is going to affect metabolic, hormonal, neural, and cardiovascular response to the training session. And obviously, load prescription is very dependent upon the individual, both in terms of training status and in terms of their training goal. Okay. So obviously, when we're talking about load-in, when we're talking about kind of how that's dependent on all those things, obviously you would expect, like we just mentioned, to be able to lift your heaviest loads earlier in the session. Okay, so exercises that are going to require you to lift heavy loads, that's why we want to put them first. Okay, obviously the volume is a big thing. Obviously the load that you're going to be able to lift for say 10 total reps in a session versus the load you're going to be able to lift for 50 total reps in a session is very different. Okay, and it's going to expose you to different things. And again, that kind of ties in with the rest interval. All right, so let's say we're talking about those 10 reps. If we're going to do 5 sets of 2 back squats with 3 minutes rest, then the load is going to be very different to if we performed 5 sets of 10 back squats with 30 seconds rest. Okay, and obviously that's going to affect the metabolic, hormonal, cardiovascular response, because obviously that 5 sets of 10 with 30 seconds rest is very much going to be muscular endurance training. Okay, whereas that 5 sets of 2 with 3 minutes rest is very much going to be more focused towards obviously strength development, and it's going to have a much more kind of neural response just because of the nature of the loading pattern and that rest period. Okay, obviously this is something which you need to be able to understand and apply, and then also be able to accurately and appropriately overload through a training cycle. Okay, so in terms of actual loads and percentages, obviously light loads, so that 45 to 50% of one rep max or less, might increase dynamic muscular strength, but probably only in untrained individuals. Okay, and a lot of that is just down to getting more comfortable with the movement pattern, developing more kind of neural adaptations, as they get used to performing the movement, and obviously confidence with the movement as well. All right. Whereas, for more advanced resistance training, or more advanced athletes who are more used to resistance training, really develop strength in particular, you need to be looking at least in that 80 to 85% of 1 rep max range. Obviously, we're going to manipulate that as we move through a training period, so we might not necessarily start there, but that's really a good window that you want to be aiming for when we're talking about strength development, okay? And mainly that's because there's obviously specific motor unit recruitment patterns during the lifting of heavy or near maximal loads that don't occur when we're talking about light to moderate loads. So if you think back to last week when we were talking about the size principle of motor unit recruitment, obviously to recruit those type 2B, type 2X muscle fibers, we need to have significant loading. Otherwise, type 1 fibers are going to do all the work, and the response that we get is going to be very different. Okay, so obviously, as we said, maximizing strength, power, and hypertrophy may only be accomplished when the maximal number of motor units are recruited, which is why we want that extra load. Okay. When we're talking about planning your training sessions and we're talking about sets, reps, percentages, all that kind of stuff, obviously there's going to be an inverse relationship between the amount of weight lifted and the number of repetitions performed. All right, so obviously it goes without saying, you're not going to expect someone to be able to do 20 reps with let's say 85% of their 1 rep max. Yeah, and equally, if we want to get the most of them performing, say, that 20 reps, we're going to choose a load that's going to allow them to work through it much more consistently and obviously manageably. We're going to reduce the risk of injury by getting that loading pattern correct. Okay, so several studies have shown that training with loads corresponding to 80 to 85% of 1 rep max, so roughly in that 1 to 6 rep max range, are most effective for increasing maximal dynamic strength. Okay, because this loading range appears to maximally recruit muscle fibers to specifically increase 1 rep max strength. Okay, as well as that, significant strength increases have been reported using loads corresponding to 70 to 80% 1 rep max. All right, but obviously the rep range has to match that. Okay, so 6 to 12 rep max range, which is typically where you're going to be in that 70 to 80% window, is typically used more for muscular hypertrophy. Although the heavy loading is effective for increasing muscle size, it has been suggested that the 6 to 12 rep max loading range may provide the best combination of load and volume to give you the adaptations that we're looking for when we're talking about developing muscular strength. Okay, obviously lighter loads than this, so that 12 to 15 rep max range, we're going to rarely increase your maximal strength, but obviously will increase muscular endurance. All right, and although each training zone has its advantages, obviously devoting 100% of training time to one zone runs a very high risk of the athlete either encountering plateaus in their training, becoming overtrained, or obviously worst case, getting injured. Okay, so essentially what we're talking about there, obviously you've got those quite broad ranges there, and I don't want you to worry about necessarily percentages too much. Okay, what's more important that you think about is the rep range. Okay, obviously the percentage can vary on quite a lot of things as to whether that 1 rep max that you're working off is necessarily accurate or not. Okay, but if we focus on the reps and making sure the level of difficulty for those reps and sets is appropriate, which obviously we don't need percentages for, then you're going to get the result that you're looking for. Okay, now that bottom sentence there, all right, obviously each training zone has its advantages, but we don't want to be working in the same place all the time. Okay, now the key for you, and again, we'll talk about this a bit more when we're talking about periodization, is finding the right way to fit over, let's say, a 12-month period, those different rep ranges together. Okay, because obviously there's advantages and disadvantages for most sports to working through all those kind of 3 different zones. Okay, so let's just say, let's use rugby for example. You're working with rugby players, obviously they come in for pre-season having probably had the best part of 4 to 6 weeks either off completely or doing very little in regards of strength training. Okay, so if you were to get them to come in and straight away get them working in that 80 to 85% range, then obviously there's going to be quite a big risk of injury just because their body's simply not accustomed to working in that training zone. Okay, whereas let's just say we phase that return to training much more gradually. So let's say we've got an 8-week pre-season. All right, for the first 2 weeks, we might be looking at the lower load but higher volume, so that 12 to 15 rep max range initially. Obviously, it's not going to have the same stress on joints because there's not the same load in, all right, but it's still going to get them back into doing the kind of resistance exercises we want them to be doing whilst not overloading them, okay? From there, we might then spend, what we've got left, we might then spend 3 weeks, okay, so that's going to take us up to week 5, working in that 70 to 80% range, okay, so focusing perhaps more on muscular hypertrophy, okay? Obviously, if they've come back from an off season where they've not been training, they're going to have lost muscle mass, okay? So working through a period of muscle hypertrophy is going to be beneficial. And then finally, we might finish off as we get closer to the season, working at that 80 to 85% range, where obviously the intensity is going to be higher in terms of the load, but the volume is going to be lower, okay? And obviously throughout that, there's lots of other things we can manipulate in terms of rest periods and the training, other exercises and types of training they do in conjunction with that, just to increase the effect of that training that we're going to be doing, okay? Obviously, touched on a little bit there, training volume, okay? And again, this is a key thing that we're going to look to manipulate throughout a training period, okay? So generally, when we're talking about resistance training, training volume is generally estimated from the total number of sets and repetitions performed during a training session multiplied by the load, okay? So nice and simply, obviously, let's say we're going to do 5 sets of 10 reps at 100 kilos, okay? Obviously, over the session, it means we've done 50 reps at 100 kilos, okay? Which means your training volume for that session is going to be 5,000 kilos, okay? Which gives us a really easy number to measure and to manipulate as you work through the season, okay? Now, obviously, altering that volume can be done by manipulating any of those 3 variables, all right? So whether that's the number of exercises performed, number of repetitions performed, the number of sets performed, or obviously the total load performed, okay? Now, key thing, especially when we're talking about strength and power, is to remember that intensity and volume are inversely related, okay? So when we talk about intensity, we're talking about the load. When we're talking about volume, we're talking about that combination of sets, reps, and load, okay? So let's just say, for example, my 1 rep max back squat is 100 kilos, all right? If working through the same kind of exercise workout structure that we spoke about before, so phasing the way through the pre-season at the beginning, the intensity, so in terms of the load, is going to be much lower. So we might be talking 50 to 60% of my 1 rep max. But let's just say, for argument's sake, I'm doing 3 sets of 15 reps. Okay, so 45 reps total. The volume is going to be relatively high. Okay, now let's say we're in that phase kind of 3 weeks before the season's about to start. All right, now I'm lifting 90% of my 1 rep max, but instead of doing 3 sets of 15, I'm doing 5 sets of 2. Okay, so my training in terms of number of reps has gone from 45 reps in a session to just 10 reps in a session. Okay, but the intensity, so the load I'm using, is much higher. Okay, so when we talk about that intensity and volume being inversely related, that's what we're referring to. Okay, and that's the key way to make sure the athletes are peaking at the right time, is to get that balance right. Okay, obviously, again, rest intervals. All right, now rest interval length is going to affect the stimulus of the session. Okay, now obviously it's dependent upon the training intensity, the goal, the fitness level, and what energy system it is that we're targeting. Okay, because that amount of rest between sets and obviously exercises significantly affects the metabolic, hormonal, and cardiovascular response to an acute bout during resistance exercises, as well as the performance of subsequent sets. Okay, and then obviously the training adaptation. All right, now I'm sure you all know acute force and power production. So in the initial that phase of training, that particular session is going to be compromised with short rest periods, but these short rest periods are going to be beneficial if we're talking about developing hypertrophy and muscle endurance training. All right, so obviously you need to manipulate those rest intervals depending upon the focus of your session. All right, obviously strength and power training predominantly stress the ATP PC system. Hypertrophy and maybe the higher rep strength training is going to be more supported by obviously ATP PC, but also glycolysis And then obviously as we move towards muscular endurance training, there's still going to be some glycolysis, but they're also going to be starting to work more aerobically. Again, all depending upon the reps, sets, and rest period that we're going to be using. Okay. Stress in the glycolytic and ATP PC energy systems may enhance training for hypertrophy, as shorter rest intervals result in significant metabolite, so lactic acid mainly, production. Okay, and to that end, studies that have restricted blood flow and used light loading during resistance exercises, which obviously is going to increase the concentration of metabolites, has been shown to increase muscle hypertrophy. Okay, so yeah, okay, so let's dig into that a little bit deeper. All right, now, obviously, when we're talking about strength training, so if we go back to the example I just used, where I'm going to be doing 5 sets of 2 and 90% of my 1 rep max, I'm going to want a long rest period. Obviously, it's going to be very much powered by the ATP-PC system, because that sets, it's not going to take me more than 10 seconds to perform, and I'm working at high intensity with a high percentage of my 1 rep max. All right, now what we're saying there about stressing the glycolytic system to enhance hypertrophy. All right, I want you to think about bodybuilding. Okay, so when you see a typical bodybuilding program, it's very much high volume, submaximal weight, working to failure, drop sets, pre-fatigue, all that kind of stuff. Okay, which obviously what they're basically looking to produce there is as much lactic acid as possible. Okay, because lactic acid it acts as a signal. Okay, which is going to signal more anabolic hormone production and signal more kind of free protein, so amino acids in your bloodstream, is going to signal them to obviously go to the muscle group that's being worked. Okay, so when we're talking purely about developing muscle hypertrophy, then that production of lactic acid is a very important thing to maximize hypertrophy, which is why bodybuilding programming and training is the way it is. Okay, so if we're looking to develop muscle mass, then that's great, but it's not necessarily going to give us the most improvements in strength, because we're spending all our time working with submaximal loads. Okay, now that bottom sentence there about blood flow restriction training. Okay, so obviously this isn't something that you would just generally do, but basically what studies have shown is that restricting blood flow, whether that's with a tourniquet to obviously restrict blood flow to the muscle, or you can get specific bands that do the same thing, because they're keeping the blood in the muscle group, preventing obviously oxygen getting to the working muscle, then it's going to increase, or not necessarily increase, but prevent the removal of lactic acid, okay, which is going to have the same effect as when we're talking about your bodybuilding training. Okay, now let's say you're working with an athlete who is recovering from injury, okay, particularly a soft tissue injury, so either ligament damage, tendon damage, a muscle tear, anything like that. All right, they're not necessarily going to be capable of lifting significant loads. All right, but they've also, because they've just spent the last 6 weeks on crutches, not being able to walk, they're going to obviously have had significant muscle wastage. Okay, so using something like blood flow restriction, so using, say, no weight but restricting the blood flow and getting them to do kind of high volume, let's just say for argument's sake, leg extensions, obviously is going to create a lot of lactic acid in the lower limb, which is going to signal muscle protein resynthesis. Sorry, it's a bit of a mouthful there. Obviously, which is going to stimulate muscle growth. All the while, they're not actually exposed to any load. Okay, so by manipulating that lactic acid production, we can actually use that when people are recovering from injury to our advantage, to get them back to developing muscle mass in muscle groups that might have been obviously wasted because of the injury. Okay. Now, repetition velocity. All right. Now, obviously, we're talking about strength here. So repetition velocity, and the way we think about it is a little bit different if we're talking about power development. Okay, but the velocity that dynamic repetitions are performed at is going to affect the neural, hypertrophic, and metabolic responses to resistance exercises. Okay, and studies have shown that strength increases are specific to the training velocity. All right, now obviously unintentional slow velocities are used during high intensity repetitions in which either the load or the fatigue are responsible for the velocity of the movement. Okay. Intentional slow velocity repetitions are used with submaximal loads where the individual has greater control. Okay, so if we're talking about that unintentional slow velocity, just imagine, you're doing a 1 rep max back squat, and obviously the speed you can move that weight at versus the speed you can move a weight, let's say 60% of your 1 rep max, is going to be very different. All right, just because of the sheer load of the movement is going to slow you down. All right, intentional slow velocity repetitions. Obviously, that's something that us as coaches are going to manipulate dependent upon the response that we're going to get, that we're trying to get from the athlete. Okay, so it's been shown that when performing a set of 10 repetitions using a very slow velocity, okay, so 10-second concentric, 5-second eccentric, compared with a slow velocity, so 2-second concentric, 4-second eccentric, a 30% reduction in training load resulted, which led to significantly less strength gains after 10 weeks of training. Okay, now obviously it should be pretty self-explanatory as to why that might be. All right, if we're talking about 10 repetitions with each rep, if it's got a 10-second concentric and a 5-second eccentric, so each rep is taken 15 seconds, then you're going to be talking the best part of 2.5 minutes to complete that set, at which point we've moved way past the point of strength training and we're moving into the realm of muscular endurance training. Okay, whereas on the flip side, that slow velocity, okay, so the 2-second concentric and 4-second eccentric, and you're talking that 6 seconds a rep, so a minute for the whole set. Okay, and obviously there we're working much more glycolytically, we're going to be able to use more weight, so obviously the strength gains are going to be higher. Okay, one of the important things on this to think about, especially when that big sentence in bold there, obviously dynamic resistance exercises show increases in strength specific to the training of velocity. So when we're talking about sports performance, and again, bearing in mind what we spoke about earlier on in the lecture about using eccentrics to our advantage, if we're performing concentric phases of movement slowly, inevitably that's going to have an impact on how we perform concentric phases of sporting movements. Right now, obviously you wouldn't kick a football slowly, so developing strength slowly isn't really going to be that helpful when we talk about transfer of training. Okay, but on the other hand, as we mentioned, manipulating the eccentric phase could actually help us get stronger faster. Okay, so if we use that example there of the 2-second concentric, 4-second eccentric, okay, what if we made the concentric as fast as possible, but kept the eccentric? What kind of adaptation are we going to get there? Okay, just something for you to have a little think about. Now, so as we said there, obviously repetition velocity is much more important when it comes to power training. Obviously, the neuromuscular contribution to the development of maximal muscle power may include. Probably should have put something else in there. But in order to maximize power training, heavy resistance training needs to be accompanied by explosive exercises. Okay, so obviously one limitation to performing high velocity repetitions with free weights is the deceleration phase. Okay, and obviously the length of this phase is dependent upon the load and the average velocity as the load is decelerated for a considerable proportion of the concentric movements, obviously, which is why when we talk about power in the next session, we're going to be looking more at like ballistic exercises, so such as bench throws, squat jumps. Okay, now obviously that deceleration phase we're talking about there is completely normal. When you're doing a back squat or a heavy bench press, then you can't keep accelerating through the whole range of motion. And equally, if you did and you let go of the weight with a heavy weight, then you're going to be in trouble when that weight comes back down. But again, when we talk about that transfer to sports performance, nobody tries to kick a football or punch somebody or make a rugby tackle slowly. It's all very dynamic, very explosive. But having said that, we also need to have, as we've mentioned before, that underpinning strength to be able to be powerful. Okay, so again, this is something we'll touch on more next week, but start to have a think about how that combination of traditional resistance exercises and ballistic exercises might work together when we're talking about developing both strength and power in athletes that need both for their sport. Okay, training frequency, all right? So again, training frequency is going to be dependent upon several factors, all right? Obviously, the volume and intensity of the training, the exercise selection, the level of conditioning and training status of the person's ability to recover, the person's nutritional intake, and the training goals, okay? So quite a broad range of things there that you're going to need to consider based on the athlete that you're going to be working with, okay? Now, obviously, the use of extremely heavy loads, especially when we've got that heavy eccentric phase and that extra DOMs that we spoke about earlier, could require up to 72 hours of recovery between sessions to make the most of those sessions and to be fully recovered, whereas large and moderate loads may require less recovery time, okay? Numerous resistance training studies have used frequencies of 2 to 3 days per week. 1 to 2 days per week tends to be more effective for maintenance, and a few studies have shown that 4 to 5 days per week is superior to 3, but again, that comes back to the level of athlete. Okay, so in beginner athletes, sometimes less is more. All right, and the fact that you can get away with doing 2 to 3 sessions a week just because their training age is that bit lower. All right, now obviously increasing training frequency may enable greater specialization. All right, as an example of that, frequencies as high as 18 sessions per week have been reported in Olympic weightlifters. Okay, and they found that frequent short sessions followed by periods of recovery, obviously nutritional intake, allow for more or higher intensity training because of obviously there's more available energy and there's reduced fatigue during the performance of exercise. Okay, so let's just walk things back a little bit. All right, now obviously what we're talking about there in terms of kind of different training ages, obviously, as we touched on last week, the adaptations to strength training can tend to diminish as your training age increases. Okay, so obviously one way that people try to get around that is by increasing the frequency of training. Okay, whereas with beginners, they can get away with doing 2 to 3 sessions a week, and that's enough of a stimulus for them to be able to improve their maximal strength. Okay, and then obviously in terms of specialization, if we can train more often, then we can focus in more on certain things just by the sheer amount of time we spend practicing. Okay, so using the Olympic weightlifting example, obviously Olympic weightlifting is a very specific sport in terms of the movements that are required. Yeah, to perform well, you just need to be able to snatch and clean and jerk. Okay, so essentially 3 movements. Right, whereas if we're talking about football player, rugby player, tennis player, any actual sport in other sports participant, then the number of exercises, or let's not think exercise, let's think just sport and movements that are required to perform, is going to be much, much higher. All right. But if we've got more training time, then we can start to focus on those movements more individually, break them down a little bit, and then obviously use resistance training or power training to help supplement the performance of those exercises on the pitch. Okay. Now, obviously, because Olympic weightlifting is a very specific sport, then doing something like, say, obviously 18 sessions per week is possible because they don't have to do the skill work. They don't have to do the tactical analysis. They don't have to do the conditioning work that, say, a footballer might have to do. So they have the time to do that number of sessions and the energy to do that number of sessions. Okay. Another thing that's important to think about when it comes to training frequency is where you are in the year and in relation to competition. Okay, so obviously if you're working with a sports team and they have a game every weekend, then it's important that your training is obviously frequency enough to show improvement, okay, but also isn't so frequent that by the time it comes to perform on a Saturday afternoon, they're still recovering from a heavy strength training session they might have done on Thursday. Okay, whereas if they're in a pre-season phase and they don't have games on the weekend, obviously your training frequency might be higher because they don't need to be peaking at the end of the week. All right. So obviously, again, training frequency is dependent upon quite a few things. All right. Now, progressive overload. Right. This is a very important concept when it comes to training in general. Okay. So progressive overload describes a gradual increase of stress placed upon the body during exercise training. Okay. So obviously, the adaptive process of the human body will only respond if it's continually required to exert a greater magnitude of force to meet higher physiological demands. Okay, so how can we create that overload? So either through increasing the load, increasing the repetitions, increasing the repetition speed, adjusting the rest period, obviously, which leads to adjustments in volume. Okay. The key thing with progressive overload, obviously, other than the fact that you do it, is that you don't do it too fast. Okay, overloading people too quickly, particularly sports people who are going to be competing on a regular basis, generally just leads to injury and burnout. Okay, which is no good when we're talking about improving sports performance. So typically, you want very small but regular increases, so that roughly 2.5 to 5%, depending on what you're doing, it might be even less, should be imposed initially until that adaptation has occurred and until they become used to the specific training that they're doing and also, competing, and they can generally tolerate the overall training load of their week as a whole. Okay. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but essentially with progressive overload, the main thing is that you make sure that it's appropriate, and also that it is occurring, manipulating any of those variables that we spoke about there. Okay. Now, again, as I've been speaking about, obviously through all of this lecture, specificity is a very important factor when it comes to sports performance. Obviously, there's a high degree of task specificity involved in human movement and adaptation that encompasses both movement patterns and force velocity characteristics. Okay, so obviously we want the training to be specific to the movements we're asking people to carry out when it comes to performance, and performed at the speed we're asking them to carry out that performance at. Okay, and obviously it goes without saying, all training adaptations are specific to the stimulus applied. The physiological adaptations to training are going to be specific to, obviously, the muscle action involved, the speed of movement, the range of motion, the muscle groups for training, the energy systems we're training, and the intensity and the volume of training. Okay, so when it comes to critiquing a training program and designing a training program, specificity is a very important thing to focus on, particularly when we're talking about improving sports performance. All right, so again, just like last week, I'm going to talk about some practical considerations when it comes to designing a strength training program. All right, so obviously we need to be focused in on the overarching goal of the period of training. Okay, so that can be the season, it can be a particular part of the season, it can be an off season, a pre-season, anything like that, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail when it comes to talking about periodization, and obviously how does that tie in with the demands of the sport. Okay, obviously we spoke about a lot of different variables there, so thinking about how they're going to be manipulated to improve the sport's performance. Okay, and also further in what we spoke about as a coach, how do we maximize the adaptations to strength training, but not taking away from the energy available for more sport specific training. Okay, both obviously in terms of on a weekly basis, so a micro basis, but then also on a macro basis when we're talking about the whole year. Okay, and then how can we decide an initial training volume if we're working with people for the first time, and then manipulate this over the course of a training period to peak for competition. Okay, so obviously here we're going to talk about that initial kind of assessment. All right, but then also thinking about how we're going to periodize that through the year, so we have times when training volume might be lower to allow performance to obviously be at a higher level because there's more energy available to perform over all sorts of different timeframes. But again, that's going to be something we speak more about when it comes to periodization, but I want you thinking about those things now. Okay, so just to finish off and give you guys a little bit of an idea when it comes to putting a program together, it just gives you just some short kind of real world examples from different sports. Okay, so obviously, as I mentioned at the beginning, I do a fair bit of work in Olympic weightlifting. Okay, so just pulled up just an example of probably a typical session for people who are doing Olympic weightlifting, particularly recreationally, where they might be training, let's say, 5 times a week for anywhere between an hour and a half and 2 hours. Okay, so obviously at the start of the session, we've got the most complex exercises. All right, so we're talking obviously a snatch is complex exercises. A complex exercise involves large muscle groups, involves a lot of coordination. So we want to be fresh when we're doing that. So obviously that's why that exercise is always first in the session. And obviously we've got quite a significant rest period there, 3 minutes between sets. because it's a very explosive, dynamic movement. We're using obviously the ATP PC system, so we want to make sure that that system is recovered to allow us to perform each set. Okay. In terms of the load in there, obviously with this person, especially within Olympic weightlifting, they generally have a very good idea of their 1 rep maxes, or if they don't, it's something that we test reasonably often, okay, relatively speaking. So we can work on very specific percentages, okay? And obviously you'll see that you're starting off around that 70% range, okay? Now, obviously, earlier on in the lecture, we spoke about that 70% range being more kind of 6 to 12 rep max range. But when we're talking about Olympic weightlifting, which is a power-based sport, and this is something we'll expand on next week, athletes tend to be most powerful in that 70 to 80% range. Okay, obviously following on from that, then we've got snatch pulls. Okay, now snatch pulls are much less complex. All right, so they're much more of a strength exercise as opposed to a power exercise. Okay, so they're second in the session, and you'll see there they're working at 100% of their 1 rep max snatch. This is okay, which is obviously generally less than what they could do if it was just say a snatch pull or snatch deadlift, for 5 sets of 5. Okay, so the volume is higher per set, and obviously overall as well, and the load, relatively speaking, is higher per set. Okay, so this is more what we're talking about when we're talking about developing strength. All right, and then finally finishing off the session with some front squats. Okay, so again, you can see the load is higher. All right, and now we're working off of a 1 rep max for their front squat. Okay, and we're talking obviously sets of 6 all the way down to sets of 3, but with an increase in load as we work through those sets. Okay, so obviously there, the volume is probably, you want to say, medium for a relatively experienced athlete, but the intensity is medium to high, with the reps decreasing as the intensity of the load increases. Okay, and obviously from there, you can easily see how you would manipulate that and create that progressive overload when the goal is developing obviously strength and power, which is needed for Olympic weightlifting. So obviously we can easily create that overload on any of those movements there by increasing the load, increasing the repetitions. You wouldn't really manipulate the rest time because of the nature of the sport. Okay, now we're going to compare that to a rugby league player in a pre-season phase of training. Okay, so like we spoke about before, the volume now is going to be higher, but the intensity is going to be lower. Okay, so you can see there for the back squat. So again, starting off with the most complex exercise, and we're going to be doing much higher set and much higher reps with much lower load. So we're talking about 2 sets of 10 with 60% 1 rep max, and then perhaps increasing the load from there. Okay, and again, you'll notice there that rest period is much shorter, that 90-second to 2-minute window. What you also see there after the 2x10 is where it says 30x1. Okay, so when we're talking about a tempo, prescribing a tempo that we want to perform an athlete, to perform a repetition at, that's how we write it. Okay, so simply put, that first number, the 3, is going to be the negative phase, so lowering down into a squat. The 0 is going to be the pause at the bottom of the lift. The X is going to be the speed we want them to perform the concentric. Okay, and the 1 is going to be the pause at the top. So if I was doing that back squat rep, I'm going to take 3 seconds on the eccentric. I'm not going to pause in the bottom. I'm going to stand up as fast as I possibly can. That's what the X stands for. We're now going to have a 1 second pause at the top. Okay, so obviously we're emphasizing the eccentric because of the nature of the load-in and of the number of reps we're going to be doing. And obviously here, kind of pre-season, then we're going to be focusing on some muscular hypertrophy alongside developing strength. Okay, again, it's going to be easy to overload, easy to manipulate, and we can progressively make that more challenging as we progress through the training cycle. All right, and then again, those last 2-3 sets. All right, now there we're focusing less complex movements in terms of the load and in terms of the coordination of movement patterns. So there's not necessarily any specific load written there because it's going to depend on how comfortable the athlete is with the movements. But equally as well, they're going to come later on in the session because obviously we want to make sure we're doing the back squats first whilst they're fresh and ready to go. Okay. Again, we've still got that tempo there. but you'll notice they've got a much shorter rest period. Obviously, the focus of these kind of 3 sets at the end is going to be more on muscular hypertrophy, and kind of focusing on smaller muscle groups in terms of isolating one leg, so more unilateral work, and then also some isometric work. Okay, now we might change that as we go through the season. Okay, so this is for the same player, but in season. Okay, and the important thing to think about here is obviously as well, this training session is going to be early in the week, as far away from the game as possible, because of the intensity involved, particularly in the back squat. So you can see we've changed there. Obviously the rep scheme, so we're doing much less reps, but with much higher percentages of 1 rep max. Okay, so going all the way up to 90% with a longer rest period, and we've taken away that focus on the eccentric phase, because again, the movement speed that we perform these exercises at is going to be specific to the adaptations that take place. So we want to be the athlete to be moving with much more speed, developing much more power. So we're going to be getting them to work through those 3 reps as fast as possible speed. Obviously, like we said before, there's going to be some unintentional slow velocity because of the load, but we want to try and limit that as much as we can. Okay, and then obviously you've got the 2 lots of 3 sets at the bottom. Now here you'll notice again the volume is much lower, and we've also this time we've paired a more kind of resistance focused exercise, so the split squat on the good mornings, with more of a power based exercise, so the single leg box jumps and the seated box jumps, again to reflect the demands of the sport, but also to reflect the where we are within the season. Okay, so obviously because we're in season now, the intensity is going to be higher, but the volume is going to be lower, because we want to make sure that we're not over fatiguing the athletes in order to perform at the weekend. Okay, so just a few things for you to think about there. All right, a few references there for you to read through as well. Like I say, if you've got any questions, then send them over to Sarah. She'll forward them on to me, and then we can discuss them in the final lecture. I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you next week.